O sea, es un sentimiento amargo porque es gente ilusionada que te envía... ¡Basta! ¡Basta! ¡Orden en la sala! ¡Orden en la sala! Muy bien. Se le acusa de los siguientes delitos. Se le acusa de belleza extrema. Se le acusa de robo de vehículo.
All right, guys.
Se le
You get me
acusa
back this week.
de apuntar.
Yay! Don't sound too enthusiastic. To break you out of those bad habits later on, particularly prose-wise, things like that. Writing with flabby prose, writing with using the same three main character that he can use at certain times in clever ways to escape problems and situations, and then to have to pay for that later on at the climactic moment of the stories, where indeed the costs that he has been paying come due. Another great example of this is Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. One of the reasons Name of the Wind works so well, I won't speak about this as much, but is that he also has a hard magic and a soft magic. And by including both of those, he's able to contrast. If you haven't read the books, he's going to a magic school, and one of the things they do is they build magical devices using sympathetic magic. It's a type of magic that people believe work in our world, that like affects like, that actually works in his world, right? And the rules, it gets a little soft in there, but mostly it's like, you do this, you get this. You do this, you get this. Meanwhile, there's a professor at the school who studies a different type of magic. This magic is the naming of things. And this magic is explained as very powerful, very mysterious, and likely to drive you crazy. And of course, the main character is drawn to this naming magic in the same way that a moth is to a flame. And that's part of the tension of the story is he going to suffer these consequences that the professor has by delving into naming magic, which the naming magic is there to reinforce this story being about a poet and a musician and talking about a magic that is more like poetry and music. You can't define it. There is engineering class in his magic school and there's poetry class. And yes, he can figure out engineering class, but he wants to go to poetry because you can't quantify poetry. And so the two work very well in a scholarly setting as kind of showing off these two different disciplines and the contrast between them. And these two stories, you do not need to have both in your books. In fact, most books only have one. I will say that you don't have to be all the way to one side or the other. In fact, usually it's very handy to be right about here with even your hard magics so that you have the mystery tool. So that later on, if you're writing a series, you can expand the magic and leave some mystery in the first book that can later on be explored and explained. The further my books go, because I tend to be pretty far on that side, the more the magic gets explained and more the holes that I've introduced in the magic intentionally at the start to get filled in. And this is how you actually have, the ending of Mistborn 1 could still work. Because Sanderson's first law is really a law of foreshadowing. If I had spent the whole first book saying, there were some Mistborn sometimes who were able to do something really weird, and we don't know how. And it might involve this. And here's this apparent contradiction in the magic system that we think should work, but we don't know why. And then later on, those things are reconciled, and the character figures something out, has been able to access the magic. That would work. In fact, most Asimov 3 Laws stories are this way. If you haven't read Asimov's 3 Laws, he's got 3 laws of robotics. This, and this. And then a robot is acting weird. It's running around in a big circle instead of doing what it's supposed to do. What's up? Well, let's go look at how the 3 laws interact with one another, and we'll find out why this robot's programming has a bug that is causing a contradiction between the 3 laws, and therefore they're acting this way. And that is kind of one of Asimov's go-to storytelling devices. Of course, he also has the robots develop some weird sense of wonder thing. We don't like it, so we destroy it. So he does have sense of wonder stories as well. But yeah, so this is a law of foreshadowing. The reason I say in a satisfying way, I want to point out before we do questions about this one, is sometimes you don't want to solve problems in a satisfying way, because you are doing something else with the scene. The example I often use for this is, you've probably seen a lot of stories where the characters in the first third of the story get into desperate situation, there is no way out of it, and then out of nowhere someone comes and saves them. Right? Probably seen a lot of this. It's done all the time in Hollywood films. Why is this done? Usually to introduce this new character. That's one of the things, right? You're like, we want to have a dramatic introduction to this character. We will have them save the other characters and show off their cool abilities in Act 1 when the characters couldn't possibly have survived. There are other reasons that narratives do this. Some of them are kind of lame, I'll admit. Some of them are quite legitimate. Introducing a character in Act 1 to save the day is very different from having an unnamed character show up in Act 3 to save you at the end, right? Han works because it's foreshadowed, but Han, if he showed up in the first third of the story, could just show up and save them and be like, oh yeah, this is my friend Han. Now you know how cool he is. So understand that these are all tools. There's not wrong ways to do this. And in fact, Sanderson's laws, I call them laws because it sounds cool. And that's basically the format that people use. But they're not laws for you. You don't have to follow these. These are rules I made for myself to tell the types of stories I want to tell, to get the type of effect that I want to get. And they might be helpful for you to understand some sort of narrative things about using your magic systems in a story. So let me ask any questions about Sanderson's first law. Yeah.
So, this is spoilers, but
Okay. So, right.
But how do you make an ending that is both satisfying and doesn't?
Right. So, when I'm talking about this, when I'm doing this right, the goal is that I am foreshadowing that something can and will happen, and that you could have figured out what was going to happen before it happens. Now, I might not always get this right. It'll depend on your own personal belief. But when Sanderson's first law is working for me, it is you could have known and figured out what was going to happen at the end ahead of time. With Oathbringer, I would argue the answer was coming down to a character's decision. You didn't know which way they were going to decide, but you knew they could decide either way. And the emphasis is if they decide one way, something happens, and if they decide another way, something happens. The setup for this is very different based on situation. Let me explain. I've got a good story for you to explain this. And the story is the two Lord of the Rings films, movie 2 and movie 3. Now, movie 2 of the 3 is my favorite of the Lord of the Rings films. And part of this has to do with the defense of Helm's Deep, right? Now, in this story, what happens is characters go to Helm's Deep to defend it against an orc, Uruk-hai, whatever, invasion, right? And they know that this is kind of one of their last stands. They're in serious trouble. The setup ahead of time is Gandalf says to them something. You guys remember what it is? Look for me at the morning of the third day. Is that what he says? Fifth day. Look for me at the morning of the fifth day. What's that? You watched it last night? So look for me at the morning of the fifth day, right? Look for me. And he rides off. The setup for that situation is if we survive 5 days, Gandalf will save us. Now, the narrative does everything it can do to make you forget that, by showing how terrible the situation is, by making them fight to the very end of their wits and their strength and their exhaustion, right? And they are basically defeated. But at the end, they go out for a final charge, and then the sun rises. And then it plays Gandalf, look for me on the morning of the 5th day. And Gandalf appears. They see him, and then an army comes up behind him, right? Now, you've seen this army leave, so the pieces were there, but the setup for the characters was not, you need to defeat these orcs or else. The setup is, if you survive this amount of time, you are okay. In the third movie, this setup is not done the same way. They are defending Minas Tirith. It is set up as if we don't protect Minas Tirith, we are doomed. And then Aragorn goes off to the ghosts. And then, as they're about to fall, Aragorn shows up with the ghosts and saves them. On a kind of strict outline basis, these two are the same. Yet in the Aragorn saving them with the ghosts, I felt just really kind of let down. I'm like, oh, okay, I guess they're okay. Still a great film. Yeah, whatever. And in the middle film, every time Gandalf comes up over that ledge and I'm watching it, I can barely keep the emotion in, right? And when the light comes down behind him and the orcs are all like, ah! And it's just beautiful. And every time when Aragorn shows up with the ghost, I'm like, all right, we're done having fun with Gimli and Legolas bantering about who killed what. We're done with this. Okay, we're done. So I would ask you, why do I have such a different emotional reaction to number 3 than I do to number 2? And this is about promises and payoffs, right? And so in both their Tolkien, or actually this is Jackson, because they don't happen exactly the same way in the book. In both of these, Jackson is solving a problem with an external force that is protecting the characters from the consequences that are coming toward them. But in one of them, they are promised if they can do this, they will receive this. And in the other one, they're promised, you need to survive. Oh, you didn't? Okay, we'll just save you anyway. Now, it is obviously much better done than that because it's a fantastic film, even the third one. But when I am looking for this to work, it's not necessarily that you need to understand exactly what the magic can do. You need to understand what the setup is. For instance, a lot of stories will say, I feel like if I can solve this problem with the magic, I will receive a dump of understanding about everything that'll let me save the day. And if you have set that up for the reader, if they figure out this problem and then that happens, the reader will be fine. They'll be like, yes, this is exactly what I was promised. If they fail to figure that thing out, they fail to make the decision, they fail to achieve what you've set up in your narrative for them to do, and then they still succeed, well, you're going to need some other way to make that work. And you totally can. But in that case, that's where Sanderson's first law is not really applying, if that makes sense. And again, I'm not perfect at this. So you can totally read one of my books and say, no, Sanderson, I don't think you completely pulled it off. I don't think you did the setup the right way I needed to for this ending to work. But this is what I'm trying to do, if that makes any sense. And that story hopefully kind of explains how I view this. Other questions about this? Yeah.
So, in regards to how do you explain your magic in an exciting way without...
Yes. So, how do you avoid the dreaded info dump? Did I tell you guys last week what I was doing with the Mistborn screenplay? No, I told the little class, didn't I? I didn't tell you guys. So I'm writing the Mistborn screenplay right now. Oh, yes. Oh. How close is it? It's not that close. Right? Basically, me writing the screenplay is not what you want to have happen. It means that I've given up on a Hollywood writing the screenplay. I'm just going to do it myself, right? I am not an expert screenwriter. I've only written one screenplay before in my life, so this will be number 2. So I'll need a lot of help to even make it work. But fortunately, I have some good help from some friends in Hollywood who are very good at screenplays, who are giving me advice. And I've done some brainstorming sessions with them. And so I'm approaching how to do this. One of the things I ran into is in the book, this isn't too much of a spoiler for the book. In the book, Kelsier takes Vin, Kelsier's the mentor figure, Vin is learning magic, out into the mist to explain how the magic system works. And in a book, it actually works pretty well. It's like, instead of sitting her down in the classroom, he takes her out and says, all right, let's try this and experiment with it. She's like, all right, we'll try this magic power. We'll try this magic power. And that alone takes it away, takes it several steps. Like, one thing you could do is include an encyclopedia entry on the magic wording. That's your worst choice. Choice number 2 is to have the characters sit and talk about the magic and get it explained. That's still a pretty bad choice, but at least it's moved to dialogue, right? Choice number 3 is let's go out and have the character experiment and make it, and having problems making it work, and the teacher instructing them. And that works pretty well in the book. In the screenplay, I don't have time for that, and it would work less well on screen. So what I do is I combine that scene and the scene also early in the book where Kelsier sneaks into House Ventura to steal a bead of adamantium, right? And in the movie version, these are the same scene. Vince followed him. She's like, you promised to train me. He's like, all right, baptism by fire. Come with me, and we're going to try these different things while we're robbing these people, right? So by overlapping those scenes, suddenly there's way more tension to, now you got to learn to do this. And if you don't, that guard is going to alert us and we'll all be in trouble. And when she, screws up, he can help out and things. But now there's a tension to the scene. And the scene combines two scenes, and it gets way more active and interesting because the reader's like, or I guess in this case it would be the viewer's like, oh, now there's some real consequences on the line to this same sort of project. So the same thing is happening, same sort of practice. Same thing is happening as happened in the book, but in a situation with increased tension. And that is also a good way to make sure this happens. Now, you have to balance that, because one of the things you risk when you're bringing it into a tense scene is that the reader might get lost and confused while an action sequence is happening, which is generally a bad idea. Fortunately, on film, I have all the ability to visualize a lot of this, so I don't have to explain it in the same way I do in the book, which makes that scene work. One of the biggest challenges to writing science fiction and fantasy is how you get across your world-building elements in a way that is not boring. And to do this, you need to construct your scenes deliberately in a way that gives you a chance to not just show the magic working, but show character and setting details while you're explaining the magic in some way. In fact, the point of the scene might be to explain the magic, but your emphasis in the scene should be making sure the character is interesting and you're showing as much or more about the character as you are about the magic, or at least you are providing excitement equivalent to that. So try to do multiple things at once and make sure you are keeping your focus on the character, all right? Okay, let's move on to Sanderson's second law. All right. So, Sanderson's second law comes about because I was sitting and thinking about powers that I put in my books. This one also kind of relates a little bit to this one. And I was at a book signing at one point. I spent a lot of time thinking about what are new powers? What are new things I can put in my books that are going to be different? And someone came to me in a book signing once, and they said, hey, I love Mistborn. It's like a whole book full of Magnetos. And I'm like, wait. Oh, wait, that's just basically Magneto, isn't it? Right? Like, what are Mistborn? You take Magneto, you mash them together with, these are not the droids you're looking for, because they can manipulate emotions, not quite, but, and you basically got Mistborn. I'm like, oh wow, am I a hack, right? As a writer, expect that question to pop up in your head frequently. Oh no, am I a hack? The answer is no, you're not, because I don't even really like that term. If you're seeking to write stories the way that you would want to read them and enjoying your stories, you are not a hack. But there's this thing of, am I original? I thought I was original, and now I realize I'm not. Well, that's a completely different story, right? You are probably going to worry you're not original too much, because the end of the day, the most original thing you can add to a story is your perspective, and that is unique to you. Now, the more you write, the more you will realize how to not be derivative, because when you start off, you will be derivative, and that is generally a problem and something you want to avoid. The more you write, the more you learn to put your own stamp on things. But generally, experienced writers worry about being derivative well past when it's not even a consideration for you at all, okay? So if you're worried about it, see if some early readers say you are. Learn how to tweak things to make them your own a little bit more. Sanderson's laws might help you, but don't stress this as much as perhaps you might. But what I realized is, I'm like, well, how did I come up with Allomancy? Why did Allomancy work? Why did I enjoy it so much? And one of the things I landed on was this idea that Allomancy, like, if you haven't read the book, you can push on pieces of metal and they'll fling you up in the air, right? It's basically, if something's heavier than you, or if it's attached to the floor and you push on it, you go the other direction. So it's vector physics used as a fun magic system, right? If you push on a coin, it flies away from you, but if it hits something heavier than you, then you're launched backward, equal and opposite reaction, right? This was really fun to write. Why? Because of Sanderson's first law sort of stuff, right? Making the characters stretch with the tools they have rather than solving the problems externally was a real blast to write, and it made this writing more exciting, more interesting to me. Thinking, how could I use this tool in a way the reader's not expecting but they could have anticipated is very fun to me. And so I spend a lot of time kind of in that space. And I realized, though, that allomancy is just a really lame form of flying, right? Like, if you could fly, then that would just be strictly better than launching off of something. And if you had like full telekinesis, you could just move things around wherever you wanted, that'd just be a better version of allomancy. And yet, I have read books with that, and the magic systems have been less fun. So why is that? And that was kind of Sanderson's second law. Sanderson's second law is that flaws or limitations are more interesting than powers. Doesn't mean the powers aren't interesting. Like the question of what if you could do this is a great story starter, right? What if you could fly? Where would you go with that? But in developing a magic system, building in the flaws, limitations, and I'll say costs, is generally more interesting and creates more storytelling potential than the powers themselves. For instance, if I said to you, you can fly, that might send you along some interesting path to telling a story. If I said, you can fly, but only as long as your parents are both sleeping, then suddenly you're like, oh, it's a very different story, right? This suddenly takes us into a different direction. My parents both need to be alive, but they both need to be asleep? Do I now move to the opposite side of the world so I can consistently be, during the day when they are sleeping, or come up with whatever flaw? You can have the classic, like, what is the one that Scott Card uses in his book? You can use the magic, but if you do, one of your living relatives will be killed, right? Suddenly, that's what the story is about. The Wheel of Time has a great example of this, right? All these mystical, wonderful powers, but the more you use them, the more likely you are to become insane and kill everyone you love. And in fact, we start with the prologue showing someone who has gone crazy and killed everyone they love, so you understand the stakes and consequences right from the get-go, which was a brilliant move. It's the same thing as putting Gollum in your story so you can see what the character will become. But the flaws and limitations and the costs are where generally your story happens. Superman has classically been a very difficult character for people to do films about. We had 1.5 really great Superman films, and then we've had several films that have had really great parts, but the authors of the films have struggled with making those Superman films click with audiences, right? And this kind of comes down to the fact that people like Superman has too much power, right? It's so hard to write a story. And yet I watched as a young man an entire series about Superman that I loved, and I still think is really fun, even though it's a 90s show, so it's way campy. That's Lois and Clark, right? And you'll see that Superman works really well on the small screen. There have been adaptation after adaptation of Superman or Supergirl that have been really fun stories to tell. And that generally is because the people telling the small-scale story have such limited special effects budgets that they can't make a big spectacle of Superman punching someone harder than that person can punch. And so they have to say, well, what else can we do? And Superman stories generally fall into one of 3 categories. The first one is what I just said. Someone has shown up who can punch harder than Superman. Oh, no, right? And that's where the movies tend to go a lot. What is the other Superman story? Somebody has kryptonite. Oh, no, I don't have my powers anymore, right? And what is story number 3? I am unable to use my powers effectively to solve this problem. Either someone who is weaker than me is in danger, so my powers, now they don't have the powers, or I would really like this person to fall in love with me. My powers don't give me that ability, except at the end of the second film, which is why there's 1.5 good Superman films. Right? Or I guess, no, that's the kiss of forgetfulness, right? But you know what I mean. Superman 2 has some goofy Silver Age stuff in it. I still love it, but it has some goofy Superman. Okay, story time. Early in my career, this has nothing to do with anything. Early with my career, I was guest of honor at a con up in like North Salt Lake or something, and they're like, the local news station wants to have you on the news in the morning show. I'm like, wow, this is really cool. I've never been on the news before. That's great. And they're like, yeah, but they're going to invite several other people, and you're all going to be like, be on TV. And like, I'm brand new. I'm like, be on TV. So I show up, and who's going to be on? It's me and Ursa, the Superman 2 villain, the one that's a woman, and a group of stormtroopers. And the nose thing was us just standing there and they're like, look at these weirdos at this science fiction convention. You should go meet them. And it's actually a fine experience, but I'm like, wow, my now claim to fame is being on TV with the villain from Superman 2. Not that one, but that one. And some stormtroopers. So somewhere someone has that clip of me standing there awkwardly being like, oh yeah, I guess the zoo has come to town and we wear stormtrooper armor. She was very nice, by the way. But that's neither here nor there. The stories that people look to tell about Superman, I think, are instructive to us because generally they are looking to tell stories about things that Superman's powers don't really influence. In fact, my favorite episode that I remember of Lois and Clark was like, there was this robot who had like kryptonite, right? And they're like, we're powering it by kryptonite, so if it punches Superman, it'll take away all his powers and stuff, right? But the whole rest of that story, this robot's here, he's dealing with something with Lois, which is really engaging and interesting because it's character relationship stuff, and his powers come into play almost not at all. They do this, they have this thing, and at the end of the episode, they're like, oh yeah, you have to go fight this robot. It's like, oh right, I can fly, and I have laser vision. So he flies up and he lasers the thing, and then he flies away, and it takes like 10 seconds, right? And that is writers who understood that Superman punching harder than something is not as interesting as the fact that he has galactic scale godlike powers, but can't interact with the human world. He's still just a nerd who can't make make relationships work. And that's why that show worked. Now, what does this have to do? Well, when you're developing your magic, naturally, a lot of your stories are going to err toward conflict. So they are going to err toward one of these kind of three stories. Either the character is not skilled enough at their magic yet and needs to level up, or they need to find something that's not working in the magic and fix it so that they can then use their magic the correct way, right? Or the magic is not working right now. What do I do? Or the magic can't solve this problem. It can maybe help me with the surrounding things, but I need to then find a way to solve this problem using my other attributes, not just my magic. And those are going to be your three paradigms for telling stories about magic. There are others, but those are kind of the three catch-alls. And all of those kind of deal with this idea of your flaws and your limitations are a big part of why those stories are working. So I view these three things as kind of three different things. And they're just my definitions that we'll talk about, but I also view them as kind of larger storytelling rules. Just like the first one's really a rule of foreshadowing, this is kind of about your characters also, right? Your characters' flaws and their limitations and the things they're willing to do and not willing to do, and the costs of certain actions are where your stories are going to happen about your character. Flaws basically are things the character could change, or things, the magic you don't understand yet. And with more application of effort or character change, you will be able to fix. For instance, I will see a flaw as, in Elantris, the whole story is about a flaw in the magic. The magic stopped working 10 years ago. We don't know why. People used to get divine powers. Now they get cursed for eternity, right? And they become zombies. And the whole story revolves around there's a flaw in the magic and we don't know what it is. Something's broken, right? And that flaw is what I build my whole story on. But in a lot of stories, there's also this flaw of we don't understand this part of the magic, or you are not good enough at the magic yet to do what you need to do. You need to practice. If the character applies themselves, if the people apply themselves, there is a solution to this problem somewhere in the narrative. Same sort of thing with a characterization thing, right? A flaw in your character is doesn't trust. Your character has good reasons for not trusting people, but they really need to learn to trust their thieving crew because these guys are actually good. And through the course of the story, you're going to learn to trust again so that you can actually have a relationship with this guy you're falling in love with. And that is, Mistborn's theme, right? There's a flaw in the character. That doesn't mean again, the character is responsible for that flaw. Sometimes life is beating people down, but it is something you can work on and fix. A limitation is different for me, both for a character and a magic system. A limitation of Allomancy is you can push and pull only directly away from yourself or directly towards yourself, center of gravity or center of mass, whatever. So there's the narrative is not making you think the character needs to be a way to fix this problem. It's just a limitation of the magic. You work with it rather than you try to fix it. For a characterization, a limitation might be something like you were born with one arm, right? The narrative, now you could imagine narratives where this character's on a quest to get a robotic arm or something, but most narratives is like, you've been born with one arm, you want to play in the NFL, you have a limitation that you're going to have to work with. There's nothing to fix, right? It's not that, if only you'd been a better person, you wouldn't have one arm instead of two. Like, that's not the theme of the narrative. The narrative is about this person who has a handicap needs to work within this handicap in order to achieve what they want to do. Magic systems are the same way. Magic system has this handicap, this limitation. You're going to work with it. And then cost. Cost doesn't play as well with characters as it does with magic. It's just kind of a good rule of thumb to ask yourself, what is your magic cost? But you can also deal with this in character by saying, if character takes this action, what is the cost to them emotionally, physically, mentally, these sorts of things. You can set up that if character makes this decision, it's going to be very difficult for them and cost them something, and that's really good tension. The same way with the magic system. The magic system where if you have this magical power, but every time you use it, one of your next of kin dies, that is a really steep cost. And you can vary these costs depending on how much you want the magic to be used and what your role of the cost is in the magic. A lot of times, and this is just fine, but a lot of times magic systems will write one of the costs as being equivalent to the bullets in a gunslinger's gun. It costs using this resource, and the character will run out of it when it's dramatically appropriate that they do. Stormlight, that sort of thing. Very common to use a cost like that with the magic. The reason that those sorts of costs are fun is because they can add narrative tension, but also you usually can tie them into the economy, really interestingly. And you have a legitimate reason if you want to tell story number 2, character doesn't have their powers. You don't have to invent a reason why they don't have their powers. You just deny them the resource. And now getting the resource can become part of the narrative, where you can set up your story as, if we can get this stuff, then I can solve the problem. And then, of course, you're really telling, generally in those cases, a different story about the character's journey, and the getting the stuff just becomes a MacGuffin for the plot. But it leads to a very useful method of being able to tell versions of story number 2 with the magic. But it also can tie things into an economics. You can add a social dimension to it in that case, where rich characters are able to use the magic more. Wow, theme. And so there's all sorts of things there, but you can also come up with very strict costs, which themselves can be really fascinating stories. You have 3 wishes. You're going to make all 3 wishes, but they're all going to go wrong, horribly wrong in some way. Go. Well, okay. We have very strongly limited magic that also is leading to a horror story, right? And so you can vary the cost to depend on how you want your story to go, but a lot of times your story is going to be about your flaws, limitation, and costs, either in character or in the magic system. Any questions about rule number 2?
So with limitations, not being good enough, how do you do a story about that versus something about if they don't have enough resources?
So it depends on the type of story you want to tell. It kind of depends on the character arc the character's on. If the character arc is, you need to get better at this, I frame it in the story as a flaw, not a limitation. I narratively structure it as, if the character will do X, Y, and Z, they will overcome this ignorance that they have and be able to succeed. Usually you tell these stories in the, I showed up to fight Darth Vader, and guess what happened? I lost my hand, and now my entire, my entire world is shot. I'm going to go train some more so that next time I can fight Darth Vader. And I'm going to train in a way that isn't just about battling the sword. I'm going to train a way that I use the revelation. So that 3rd movie works because a flaw has been overcome in Luke, where he realizes that just slamming his lightsaber against Darth Vader is not the way to win that battle. But it could also be couched as a limitation. I used this one in The Rhythmatist. In the arithmetic, certain people have magic, certain people don't. And someone who loves the magic doesn't have it. And the story is framed as a, you aren't going to get this thing.